Dear colleagues from civic society and my friends, I would like today to talk about the pedagogy of suffering and the lesson of freedom. On 9th February 1945, a young captain of Red Army artillery is arrested following the interception of his conversations with a friend and sentenced to 8 years in prison for disrespectful remarks on Comrade Stalin. It was a case of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who in prison will discover his great literary talent that would make him one of the greatest writers of the 21st century. Through the huge force of persuasion that literature possesses, the Soviet Gulag drama will be known by the whole world. However, the above-mentioned event represents by a tiny piece in a diabolic mechanism in which the communist dictatorship has replaced the fundamentals of civilization by ideological surrogates in a tenacious attempt to transform the history of half a century into a tragic ordeal for the entire humanity. On the other hand, that event shows that so-called unfreeze of Stalin's repression that took place during the war had come to an end before it was really over. The criminal actions that had already made millions of innocent victims in the USSR would start again with even greater fury. This time, they would cover a much wider space, also including Central and Southeastern Europe. At the end of the Second World War, the United Nations General Assembly adopted and signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the first document with universal vocation meant to defend the real values of humanity. The large number of agreements signed by different countries seems to indicate a stabilization of society and of its rights after the chaos caused by the two world wars and the ideologies they were based on. Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and Yugoslavia were among the United Nations founders. Romania, like other countries under the Soviet influence, would also join them. Only few would have suspected that this document and its principle would be brutally violated in the communist countries. But what caused such an attitude? The answer lies in the contrast between the surface politics of those states and the new communist ideology that they had adopted. The human person has been replaced by an individualized one, whose existence is entirely dependent on their affiliation to a group. Any counter-reaction to the group principles attenuates up to dissolving their identity and exiles them to the periphery of society. The utopia of equal rights, the elimination of a constructive competition, the removal of the right of freedom of speech have led to the emergence of an amorphous form which claimed itself society. Here, ideology replaces feeling. The freedom of speech is transformed into a mere slogan. Religion is replaced by the communist one-party creed, and more or less concealed form of terror are substituted for freedom. All these transformations have resulted in a new phase of Eastern Europe, furrowed by the pain of millions of people. The result, the establishment of communism in Eastern Europe by violent means and by the bloody repression of anti-communist resistance. The elimination of real or potential opponents was achieved by incarcerating them in centers for torture-based re-education, prisons with extermination regime, forced labor camps, political assassination, summary execution, mass deportation. Final count, millions of deaths, tens of millions of ruined human lives. Beyond the Iron Curtain, the countries spared from the red scourge could do nothing but watch, most of the time helplessly, as the convulsion of the countries where communism had become a state of fact. The only way to help them seemed to acknowledge the human rights to all those for whom the only reality was that enforced by the dictatorial communist regime. Nowhere else in the world did the Declaration of the Human Rights hold such influence and power as in former communist countries. It is a lever that led to the dissolution of this system in the Eastern Europe countries. Where did this influence come from? From the fact that the Declaration principles represent the fundamentals of human existence, regardless of race, religion, or political affiliation. Their politics promotes a natural way of life in which each person is unique by what they do, think, or feel. When the communist oppressions, censorship, and terror seemed to ensure a peaceful future for the system, the suffering it had caused turned it into a true pedagogy of freedom, thus forming strong characters able to dissolve this state of fact. On August 1st, 1975, 33 heads of state and government from European countries, along with leaders of the United States and Canada, signed the final act of the Helsinki Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It ratified the inviolability of the borders, and they had been established at the end of the World War II. But it also contained a so-called third basket regarding the free circulation of people and ideas. The Helsinki Act was considered by the leader of the USSR and other communist states in Eastern Europe a great victory that consecrated the new borders of Soviet Empire. The democratic intellectuals seized the change they are offered. In August 1976, the KOR is created in Poland, that is a defense committee of those persecuted by the communist regime. In Czechoslovakia, in January 1977, 238 persons signed Charter 77, which required the application of the Basket 3 in the Helsinki Accord. In 1978, reflection circles centered around writers and philosophers, scientists and dissident artists are initiated in Hungary, in the Baltic country, as well as in Russia. The fall of communism was above all an ideological collapse that had prepared the political fall of the dictatorial regimes within most of the former Soviet bloc countries. In this context, culture played a fundamental role. At the same time, with the official jargon, an underground discourse appeared, aiming to denounce imposture and mendacity, as well as to reject those which, as a well-known communist dissident, Romanian dissident Doina Cornea said, have ceased to think. For the Soviet Empire, overarmed for a cold or warm war, the peril did not come from the West, with which it was dealing in a successful manner. The peril did not come from the American missiles. It came from their own country's intellectual, despised by the men of the system. Who is that musician? Gorbachev asked it when a professor from the Musical Academy Vilnius, Vytautas Lambergis, dared to proclaim Lithuania's independence on behalf of the Sąjūdis civic movement in defiance of the KGB troops. The peril came through the democratic intellectual speech and through their writing illegally spread by rudimentary means. In 1999, I awarded the Presidential Gold Medal, a decade since the fall of communism in Central and Southeastern Europe, to the former president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev. I added him to such recipients as Walesa, Havel, and Pope John Paul II for the role his glasnost politics have had for the reawakening of the oppressed nations within the USSR. Mikhail Gorbachev's attempt to reform communism had lamentably failed, but by the end of the 80s, confirming the certitude that many intellectuals from the former Soviet bloc had from the beginning, that the communist system cannot be reformed, but only done away with. The effects of the democratic, intellectual, humanistic discourse did not take long to materialize. Movements like the Polish Summer or the Prague Spring prepared the ultimate fall of the communist regime during the early 90s. An ideology where human rights are almost non-existent cannot last forever. The students' riots in Poland in the spring of 1968 or the Prague Spring showed that young people cannot stand in the communist lies. Echoes of this movement were felt in Romania too, through the miners' riot in the Jew Valley in 1977 or that of the workers in Brasov in 1987. Suffering, long used as a terrible instrument for control on oppression, become the gateway to freedom. When in 1989, millions of workers marched through this gateway, the communist dictatorship that had been claimed to rule on their behalf suddenly collapsed through a peaceful revolution. Only in Romania, the communist regime set up through murder and violence was indeed through murder and violence. 1,200 dead persons, 3,500 seriously injured, and thousands of tortured people paid the price for freedom in Timișoara and Bucharest. When looking into these events, almost 20 years after, the collapse of Soviet bloc, they do confirm that asserting human rights is synonymous with the expression of an authentic human identity. Not taking them into consideration means the inevitable return to a condition that the entire Eastern Europe tries to forget. The pedagogy of the past suffering has undoubtedly achieved its target, but in the new context of succession to the European Union, it should teach the lesson of freedom and opens to the authentic values of humanity. The transition in Eastern Europe has not been the only transition during the last 20 years. The whole world passes, in fact, through a transition. The strategic alliances have formed fragile constellation. The diplomatic priorities are changing in the light of an ever-moving geopolitical configuration. The shifts of this new millennium do not exclude any area of life. The form of the substance of knowledge are rapidly evolving. The technological revolution effects become more and more tangible, and the sphere of telecommunication practically spans the entire planet. Economic practices and financial instruments evolve under the impulse of the fast dynamic, and the fluctuation of the capital markets are triggered by an almost unpredictable logic. At the same time, traditional models are overshadowed by unusual behavior, and more often we have to respond to bioethical dilemmas inconceivable a few decades ago. Our present world faces a series of paradoxes. Underdevelopment does not exclude arming. Democracy does not eradicate corruption, and market economy fails to prevent ecological disaster and unemployment. 50 years after it was adopted, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is systematically defied either on ideological pretext or under the endemic burden of poverty. It would be inappropriate to leave out of this short analysis what might be called the globalization of vices. Organized crime, traffic of drugs, weapons, radioactive substances or human organs, child prostitution, pedophilia, underground economy, tax dodging and forced immigration are the most striking but not only aspects of worldwide ills that government, law forces or humanitarian organizations have to do battle against, often admitting their inefficiency. The past teaches us that no civilization or social structure in the history has just vanished like the mythical Atlantis. The source of the above-mentioned disorder belongs more to time rather than to space. On a smaller and smaller planet, deeply heterogeneous collective periods confront each other. The West has stepped into the so-called postmodern, post-industrial age. The Eastern Europe countries cross post-communist times mean to provide the full evolution to modernity. On the other hand, many societies of our contemporary world rely upon a pre-modern mentality. Politics and economics have succeeded in organizing the planet's space, but not also its time. Through agreements, government can bring together geographically far distant countries. In their turn, the world economy players can build the infrastructure necessary to assure any type of connection between human communities. Physical distances thus become very relative. However, this is not the case when talking about the time perception gaps. These gaps generate contradictory horizons of expectation. No one would object if diversity of time perception would lead only to different personal ideas. Unfortunately, from this point on, not only our personal desires split, but also community attitudes expressed through political offensive options. All kinds of misunderstandings occur today mainly because the different branches of the world live inside parallel histories. The big challenge of this millennium seems to be related to the question, what can we do for all the planet's inhabitants to become truly contemporary? We are facing a communication problem, and I believe that at his level, a better understanding of the human rights concept plays a fundamental role. The Oslo Freedom Forum is a good opportunity. First, we can try to make a distinction between the human rights and its related concepts such as democracy and the rule of law, upon which is focused the energy of the civil society. From our experience during the communist regime, we can understand the easiness with that the totalitarian regime may accept the rule of law principle. I could see how the free election slogan, shooted in front of the tanks and weapons belonging to the communist repression system, could be used for the seizure of power by the former communist nomenclature and the new oligarch. I did see how the shop window democracy could disguise itself into a real democracy. I did see how manipulating the public opinion through the oligarch-free media can be more effective in the market economy and democracy times than the communist propaganda spread by the official media of the totalitarian regime in which no one believed anymore. I did see how the commander and the authors of crime against their own people could fend off criminal responsibility through prescription because the agreement regarding genocide do not apply to their situation, and the general recognition of crime against humanity is thus delayed. After all, can we actually give human rights a generally accepted definition? We live in a more or less the same 21st century world, thanks to international law and by virtue of technological progress. We will not really have a dialogue until we live in the same type of time. But in order to stand before one another with our particular affinities and needs, it is necessary to establish a universal consensus referring to those moral values that protects not only each community, but also each person. How could we initiate a real dialogue to discover it? It's risky to establish such a consensus around the idea of good. We can submit that for centuries. From now on, every society will have its own views about its spiritual and earthly welfare. Trying to standardize this concept means to advocate the establishment of a single type of thinking and to ineffectively multiply the outbreaks of tensions. Political doctrines, symbolic context, local tradition, and belief systems are irreducible. There are therefore legitimate suspicions of any syncretistic project able to relativize the uniqueness of these discourses and representation. No one, a politician, thinker, religious leader, or ordinary man, is willing to sacrifice his identity. We cannot talk effectively if the interlocutor feels the danger of having his identity maimed. Nothing allows us to pretend that our offer is superior in absolute terms compared to one made by others. On the other hand, nobody can claim today to reduce the whole human family to the denominator of his own political, economic, cultural, or religion options. Therefore, if we cannot always perceive the common good, it seems to me more reasonable to begin with identifying the common harm. It is the interest of all nations to meet on the same ground in order to reject what they all reckon to be intolerable. I am confident that everyone here refuses from the very beginning the idea of war, terrorism, torture, pollution, crime of opinion, xenophobia, racism, genetic manipulation, exploitation of children, social exclusion, hunger, professional discrimination of sex, religion, or ethnic affiliation. We have the duty to diagnose together these diseases so that we can heal together the wounds that they continue to make. Moreover, we cannot forget that we paid a toll of tens of millions on human lives from the experience of the communist regime, which tried to alienate us from our natural humanistic vocation. The freedom regained through human sacrifice has given us all not only rights, but also responsibilities that we are gradually getting used to under often difficult social and psychological conditions. From half-century, the citizens of the former communist countries were deprived of all their rights, including the right to life. The lesson of their suffering and struggle is the first step for understanding the great lesson of every individual liberty within the boundaries of respect for the other individual's liberty. Thank you.